How good or bad was the everyday life of children in ancient Japan? What did they eat? How did they learn? What did they work on? For most of history, childhood there wasn't easy, but it also wasn't joyless. The average child was born into a small wooden house, usually part of a farming family. Forget palaces or silk. Most people lived simple, quiet lives surrounded by rice fields, forests, and rivers. A typical morning started before sunrise. The house would be filled with the smell of smoke from the cooking fire and the sound of their parents getting ready for work. Japan's climate could be cold and damp, so homes were built with wooden floors and paper walls that let light in but not much warmth. Kids didn't get to sleep in. From the moment they could walk, they helped. The oldest children fetched water from the well or river. Younger ones gathered sticks or weeds to feed animals. Parents didn't think of it as work. They saw it as training for life. There wasn't really a childhood phase the way we think of it today. Childhood was about learning your place, your duties, and your role in the family. Most families were farmers, so a lot of lessons came from the land. Kids learned how to plant rice seedlings in neat rows, how to fish in the streams, and how to harvest vegetables before the rains came. They learned by watching. No one sat down and explained things step by step. If you messed up, you got corrected fast, but not usually with anger. More like, do it right next time. Life depended on everyone knowing what to do, but it wasn't all chores. Kids had fun too, and their games often reflected the world they lived in. They played tag, hide and seek, and simple ball games. They made toys from bamboo, whistles, spinning tops, or small dolls made from scraps of fabric. Boys loved building little wooden swords or pretending to be warriors. Girls practiced balancing trays or carrying water, things that looked like play but were really preparation for adult life, and everyone loved the seasons. Spring meant flowers and chasing butterflies. Summer meant swimming in rivers. Autumn brought kite flying and harvest festivals where kids could eat sweet rice cakes and watch dancers in masks. Religion was part of life from the start. Families prayed to Kami, the spirits believed to live in everything, from mountains to rivers to ancestors. Kids were taught to bow before shrines, to clap twice before prayers, and to thank the spirits for good fortune. The idea was simple. If you respected nature and people, good things would come back to you. That belief shaped how children behaved. Politeness wasn't just good manners. It was spiritual balance. Education depended on when and where you lived. In the early periods, most kids learned from their parents or local monks. Boys from wealthier families might study reading, writing, and calligraphy in temple schools, using brushes and ink on paper made from mulberry trees. They copied Chinese characters for hours, often without understanding every meaning at first. Repetition was the point. Girls were rarely sent to formal schools, but they learned domestic skills: weaving, sewing, poetry, and the art of good manners. A polite daughter brought pride to her family. As Japan entered the Han period, kids from noble families had lives that looked completely different. They wore silk robes, studied music and poetry, and were taught how to write beautiful letters with flowing ink. But even then, strict rules shaped them. Everything was about discipline, respect, and reputation. A single mistake could embarrass your entire family, so children learned early to control their emotions and stay composed, no matter what. Meanwhile, most kids in villages grew up rougher. Their games were outdoors, their feet were calloused, and their hands worked as soon as they could grip a tool. They didn't have paper or brushes, but they had songs, stories, and festivals. Elders told tales of spirits, heroes, and ghosts to teach lessons. These stories stuck. Some are still told in Japan today. By the time a child reached 12 or 13, they were considered nearly grown. Boys began working alongside men in the fields or training in local militias if their families had warrior ties. Girls learned how to manage homes and support their families. Marriages could happen young. especially in rural areas, but not always. Sometimes they waited until the family could afford it. And like in most of the ancient world, love between parents and children was real but practical. Mothers worried about their kids, but didn't have the luxury of overprotecting them. Disease, hunger, and natural disasters were part of life, so people grew used to loss. But that made the small joys, laughter at a festival, a good harvest, a child's success in temple school, mean even more. Ancient Japanese childhood wasn't about freedom. It was about becoming useful, respectful, and aware of your place in the world. But within that discipline, there was a quiet beauty, moments of warmth, play, and connection that made life more than just duty. As children in ancient Japan got older, the world around them began to change, not in appearance, but in weight. The same rice fields, rivers, and shrines that once felt like playgrounds now carried expectations. By the time a child reached 6 or 7, the word child meant something different. You weren't just small. You were in training to be calm, respectful, and useful. Every day taught something. You learned to bow lower, to speak softer, to wait longer before answering a question. The way you sat mattered. The way you carried things mattered. A single careless word to an elder could earn a sharp correction, not because your parents were cruel, but because every action reflected your family's honor. Even laughter had its limits. Children were encouraged to be happy, but never loud. Discipline wasn't shouted. It lived in silence. A raised eyebrow from a parent said more than any punishment could. If a child cried over small things, they were told to endure quietly. Gaimon, the art of patience. Enduring discomfort wasn't weakness, it was strength. In a country where storms, earthquakes, and hunger were regular visitors, that calmness kept people together. The work grew heavier too. In rural villages, older kids began helping with planting or weaving. They were no longer just helping, they were needed. Fathers taught sons how to read weather, fix tools, and respect the land. Mothers showed daughters how to manage food stores and care for younger siblings. No one said, "Someday this will be yours." It was understood. Responsibility wasn't a milestone, it was an inheritance. Yet even in all that structure, there was still room for joy. When the fields were quiet, kids ran the streams, caught insects, and carved toys out of bamboo. They played tag and balancing games, threw pebbles across rivers, and built tiny forts in the forest. Childhood might have been short, but it wasn't joyless. It was simply respectful, and the seasons were their teacher. Spring meant planting, summer meant endurance, autumn meant celebration, and winter meant patience. During festivals, kids forgot the quiet rules for a night. They wore bright yukata, cheered at drummers, and danced around fires. Food was shared, songs echoed through villages, and for a brief time, even parents laughed like children. Festivals weren't escapes. They were reminders, a release that kept the discipline bearable. Education, for most, didn't mean classrooms. It meant imitation. Children watched, copied, and absorbed. A boy learned to tie knots or sharpen tools by watching his father's hands. A girl memorized the rhythm of weaving by sitting beside her mother. It was education without words. For those near temples or towns, schooling added structure. Boys practiced writing kana with brushes, copying poems and Confucian phrases about loyalty and humility. But even there, learning wasn't about ambition. It was about harmony. Religion was always close by. Kids visited shrines with their parents, washed their hands before clapping twice, and whispered silent thanks to Kami, the spirit said to live in rivers, stones, and trees. The idea that the world was alive and watching shaped everything. It made children careful, gentle, aware. Breaking something wasn't just clumsiness. It was a small offense to the spirit within it. As they grew, these lessons stopped feeling like lessons. Respect became natural, patience became instinct, and quiet became comforting. A child who once squirmed during ceremonies now sat perfectly still. A boy who once ran barefoot through rice paddies now helped repair them. A girl who once giggled during prayers now led her younger siblings through them. Nothing had changed outwardly, but inside, everything had. And that was the hidden magic of growing up in ancient Japan. It didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't about reaching an age. It was about reaching a state of awareness. The world expected you to become steady, balanced, and graceful. But the truth was, you didn't become those things through rules. You became them by living in a world that never stopped teaching you how. By the time those quiet lessons sank in, childhood had already started to slip away. The children who once played by the riverbanks now rose with the sun to take on real work. They didn't complain. Most didn't even think to. In their eyes, this was what life was meant to become. There was no moment where someone said, "You're an adult now." It simply happened through motion, through repetition, through quiet days that slowly hardened into responsibility. For boys, that meant stepping into the rhythm of labor. They learned to lead oxen through muddy fields, to repair wooden plows, to haul rice stalks with practiced efficiency. Their fathers corrected them with few words, sometimes none at all. A misstep, a tool dropped, a gesture too rough. The message was clear without being spoken. Over time, the boys' hands toughened, their backs straightened, and their silence became confidence. Girls found their rhythm inside the home. What began as helping soon became mastery, kneading dough, weaving thread, making miso, tending gardens. They weren't just learning how to cook or clean. They were learning how to run a family. Their mothers showed them how to stretch food through bad seasons, how to read the mood of a household, how to keep peace without needing to raise their voice. It was a quiet power, invisible to the outside world, but central to how villages survived. The home was where everything began, and everything returned. Evenings brought everyone back together, weary but whole. The air filled with the smell of rice and smoke, the soft sound of chopsticks against clay bowls. Children listened to their elders' stories while their hands stayed busy, weaving straw sandals, folding paper charms, repairing baskets. These weren't chores. They were the unspoken language of continuity. Every movement connected them to those who came before. In wealthier families, the shift into adulthood came with education and ceremony. Boys studied under monks, learning Chinese characters, poetry, and ethics. They practiced calligraphy until their wrists ached, copying moral sayings that reminded them of balance and restraint. Some trained in archery or horseback riding, not for sport, but to build control. Girls from noble households studied music, dance, and etiquette. They learned to move gracefully, to speak in measured tones, to notice small details that others might miss. Their world revolved around precision, not of skill, but of presence. Even for ordinary families, life revolved around presence. A child who had once been restless learned to move with purpose. They spoke when needed, helped without being told, and carried an awareness that life depended on every person doing their part. That awareness, that collective rhythm, was what gave Japan its calm strength. Still, not every lesson came from peace. Nature reminded them that the world could change without warning. Floods destroyed fields, typhoons tore through villages, and earthquakes shook the ground they trusted. But the people didn't curse the sky, they rebuilt. Children watched this resilience and absorbed it wordlessly. They learned that stability wasn't something given. It was something created again and again, through patience. The older kids became, the more they started to see the pattern, how everything in life connected. The same patience used in farming was needed in relationships. The same care used in weaving cloth applied to raising children. Work and virtue weren't separate. They were reflections of each other. That's what growing up meant in ancient Japan. Not gaining freedom, but gaining understanding. Festivals, once a blur of excitement, began to feel different too. As children, They ran through crowds chasing fireflies. As teenagers, they helped set up the lanterns, serve food, or played flutes in the procession. It was still joyful, but now it had meaning. The laughter of children, the rhythm of drums, the glow of the fires, it reminded them of where they came from and what they were protecting. And while childhood ended early, innocence didn't vanish. It simply changed form. The playfulness of youth turned into pride in work. The curiosity turned into wisdom. Their world was small, but it felt complete. There was beauty in repetition, peace in duty, and strength in restraint. They didn't dream of escaping their villages or chasing faraway ambitions. They dreamed of living well, of keeping their families safe, their fields fertile, their communities stable. That was their version of success. And in its quiet way, it worked. Because from those ordinary children grew a culture that valued harmony over chaos, balance over conquest, and discipline over desire. That was the quiet revolution of ancient Japan, one that began not in castles or courts, but in the steady hands of children who learned, year after year, how to live with grace. By the time those children crossed into adulthood, they no longer thought of themselves as individuals in training. They were part of something larger, a family, a village, a chain of lives stretching backward and forward through time. The lessons of childhood weren't memories anymore. They were instincts. Every movement, how they bowed, how they spoke, how they worked, had been shaped by years of quiet practice. They didn't talk about discipline. They simply lived it. The villages they grew up in stayed the same, but how they saw them changed. The same rice paddies that once felt endless now represented duty. Every handful of soil they touched carried the work of their ancestors. Planting rice wasn't just survival, it was gratitude. Even the rituals they performed before farming, small prayers whispered to the kami of the land, weren't superstition to them. They were conversations with the world itself, an acknowledgement that they were guests in nature's house. Young men who once followed their fathers silently through the fields now led others. Their backs were straight, their gestures measured. They knew when to speak and when silence said more. The ones who had left home for training, scribes, monks, or samurai, carried those same quiet manners into their new worlds. The discipline learned in childhood became the structure of every profession. Even warriors were taught that restraint was the highest form of strength. A man who could draw his sword calmly was worth more than one who drew it in anger. For women, adulthood meant both burden and power. They became the center of the home, the invisible spine of family life. They managed food, money, and emotions with equal care. They taught their children the same patience their mothers had taught them. When husbands left for war or work, women kept the household running, guiding entire families through uncertainty. They were rarely praised for it, but they didn't need to be. Their pride came from stability, from knowing that life continued smoothly because of their hands. Outside the home, community bound everyone together. Villages were small worlds of cooperation. If one person's harvest failed, neighbors helped. If someone's roof broke, others came to fix it. Those bonds had been formed in childhood, when kids learned to share food and obey elders. By adulthood, that shared trust turned into survival. Japan's strength wasn't built on wealth or armies. It was built on the everyday reliability of ordinary people who kept their promises and worked without complaint. And through all of this, art and beauty quietly persisted. Farmers decorated their tools with carvings. Fishermen tied charms to their boats. Women arranged flowers or folded paper cranes, not for decoration, but as small acts of mindfulness. Even hard labor had its rhythm, its grace. The Japanese word shokunin, meaning craftsman, didn't just describe skill. It described pride in doing something well. That pride started in childhood, when kids were told, if you do one thing, do it carefully. As generations passed, the children of farmers, artisans, and warriors began shaping the foundation of Japanese identity. The manners that once seemed small, bowing, speaking politely, showing restraint, became the language of the entire society. Temples and courts might have written the laws, but villages lived them. The values learned in small wooden homes spread outward until they defined the culture itself. Seasons marked the years, but memories marked the lives. When spring returned, adults saw their own children chasing the same butterflies they once did. When summer came, they helped their families through the heat and rain. Autumn festivals returned with familiar songs, and during winter, they gathered around the same fires where they had once listened to their elders' stories. Life didn't move forward in lines. It circled, like the moon above the rice fields. And as they grew older, the adults began to see what their parents had seen, that raising a child wasn't about teaching them everything. It was about shaping their heart to notice what mattered. Every generation carried the same quiet wish, that their children would learn to live with grace. What began as lessons in politeness became lessons in survival, and what began as survival became culture. The same children who once learned to endure in silence became the backbone of a civilization built on harmony, a balance so deeply rooted that it could withstand centuries of change. The average kid of ancient Japan never set out to build a legacy. They simply learned how to work, how to listen, and how to live without wasting words. And in doing that, they created a society that valued peace, not because it was easy, but because they had been taught, since childhood, how much effort peace actually takes. As generations passed, the children who had once chased dragonflies by the river became the parents, elders, and storytellers of new ones. Life in ancient Japan didn't change quickly, but the people did. What began as survival slowly turned into tradition, and what began as obedience turned into wisdom. The lessons that shaped one generation quietly folded into the next, like ripples spreading across still water. Those who had grown up learning patience now taught it. The same parents who once learned to bow properly now watched their own children try. Clumsy at first, then graceful. The same voices that once corrected them gently now used the same tone with the next generation. It wasn't instruction anymore. It was inheritance. Each small habit, cleaning after meals, folding clothes neatly, speaking softly, was a thread tying the past to the present. By then, Japan's villages had changed just enough to show progress. Stronger homes, more structured roles, clearer rules, but the spirit stayed the same. Work was still sacred, honor still mattered, and childhood was still seen as preparation for both. The difference was that now, people began to understand how powerful those small lessons truly were. They had watched them shape entire communities, hold families together through famines, and even bring peace to lands that had once been divided. Festivals became the calendar of memory. Every season carried a familiar rhythm: planting in spring, prayers for rain in summer, harvest offerings in autumn, and stories by firelight in winter. Each event tied the living to their ancestors. Parents brought their children to the same shrines they had visited as kids, offering the same prayers for health, luck, and protection. The faces changed, but the words stayed the same. It was how Japan remembered itself, not through books or monuments, but through practice. Even as some children left their small villages to become monks, craftsmen, or warriors, the lessons of their upbringing followed them. The self-control that made a boy useful in the rice fields also made him a good soldier. The patience a girl learned while weaving became the precision of an artist's hand. The kindness taught through small household rituals turned into the empathy that guided leaders and teachers. The culture's strength didn't come from wealth or conquest. It came from those quiet foundations laid in childhood. And while the rest of the world often praised kings and conquerors, Japan's legacy grew from something smaller, from its ordinary people. The children who learned to live carefully became adults who built carefully, who spoke thoughtfully, who treated the world as something worth tending to. The shape of their days, modest, rhythmic, and balanced, created a kind of invisible order that survived long after the people themselves were gone. Even centuries later, traces of that old world still lingered. The idea that effort should be quiet, that beauty should be simple, that community should come before self. All of it began in those small houses with paper walls, where children learned to bow before they could speak. It is what made Japan's culture endure, a sense that greatness doesn't come from noise or power, but from harmony. For most of those children, life was never grand. They didn't write poems or hold swords. They held families together. They didn't chase fame. They chased the harvest. Yet, without knowing it, they built the moral fabric of a nation, one that prized peace over pride, endurance over rebellion, and grace over force. And maybe that's why, even now, their influence is still visible. You can see it in the way people greet each other with a bow, in the care of gardens, and the sound of temples ringing at dusk. These are not echoes of nobility. They're echoes of ordinary childhoods, repeated 1,000 times over centuries. So when we imagine what it was like to be an average kid in ancient Japan, it is not the hardship or simplicity that defines them. It is the quiet brilliance of how they lived. They grew up learning to find beauty in restraint, strength in silence, and peace in routine. And from that, they created something extraordinary. A culture that never forgot how to be gentle, even when the world demanded otherwise. Because in the end, the story of those children ain't into just Japan's past. It is the reason Japan still feels timeless. Every bow, every festival, every small act of care is a fragment of their legacy, the echo of an ancient childhood that never truly ended.